Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's presentation from the Jewish Genealogy Society of Pittsburgh. This program is made possible with support from the William M. Lowenstein Genealogical Research Endowment Fund at the Jewish Community Foundation. For those of you who don't know, I'm Steve Jaron, president and re-founder of the organization. I'll introduce our speaker as soon as I finish with some housekeeping items. We will be recording this session, so if you don't want to appear on screen, please turn off your video. Please make sure your microphones are muted, and please put all questions in the chat and we will answer them at the end. For those of you who don't already follow us, our schedule for the next few months is as follows. On September 19th at 1 p.m. U.S. Eastern, Adina Newman will be presenting her talk, Practical Genetic Genealogy and Endogamy, Making Sense of Your Ashkenazi Jewish DNA Matches. In October, to celebrate the intersection of Family History Month and International Jewish Genealogy Month, the JGS of Pittsburgh will be hosting our first Ask the Experts panel on October 31st, 2021 at 1 p.m. U.S. Eastern. These experts come from a variety of backgrounds, interests, and areas of expertise. These experts will be Caitlin Hollander, Tammy Heps, Jarrett Ross, and Michael Waas. For more information, please download the flyer that will be in an email to everybody. Please register by September 30th for a chance to submit your questions in advance to one or all of our panelists. And again, I mentioned download the flyer. On November 14th at 11 a.m. U.S. Eastern, we'll be hosting a program with author Jessica Weibel about her book, Dead Letters, Delivering Unopened Mail from a PA Ghost Town. And I need to double check with Eric about if that's still a hybrid program or not. Supposedly it is. For more information about or to register for our future programs, please visit our website, which I'll put in the chat. All of our regular programs are $5, except for Ask the Experts, which is $10 for non-members. All programming is free for members of the JGS of Pittsburgh. Cost for membership in our organization is $18 a year and includes free access to all programming, subscription to our newsletter, access to the members only section of our website, and access to our private Facebook group. Today's speaker is Michael Waas, a heritage professional specializing in site research and evaluation and archival research. He received his bachelor's degree in anthropology with a specialization in historical archaeology from New College of Florida. And the subject of his senior thesis was the archaeology of ethnogenesis of the Seminole people of Florida. He then received his master's degree from the Department of Jewish History at the University of Haifa, and the subject of his MA thesis was, and I'm going to mispronounce this, Historia Eoi, a comparative study on the development of Jewish heritage of the former Ottoman Empire. He received the Gaon Prize for Outstanding MA Thesis Research for the academic year 2017 to 2018 of the Moshe David Gaon Center of Judeo-Spanish Ladino Culture, as well as the prize for research into the heritage of Sephardi and Mizrahi Jewry, awarded by the Ben Zvi Institute and the Israeli Ministry for Education for the year 2017-2018. He has presented papers at multiple international conferences on Sephardic studies, including most recently the Terras de Sephard Conference in Bragança, Portugal, and the Annual Society for Sephardic Studies Conference in Lisbon, Portugal, both in June 2019. He also volunteers his time as the anthropologist and historian of the Abatenu Genetic Census of the Jewish People Project. Sephardic heritage and history can be presented in radically different ways in different places. Michael, co-administrator of the Sephardic Diaspora Group on Facebook, will discuss three heritage projects in the former Ottoman Empire, Salonika, Izmir, and Tyre, which have each taken a different approach to the task. Each of these cities has vibrant and active Jewish heritage projects. However, their shared history as Ottoman Jewish communities and the fact that they have ongoing projects is where their similarities end. And now without further ado, here's Michael.
Thank you, Steve. Just a quick correction on the pronunciation of the city you were struggling for is Bragança, northern Portugal. So let me make this full screen. Everybody can see the presentation fine? Okay, great. So thank you so much, Steve, for inviting me to speak. The title of my lecture is Muestro, Yerusha, Jewish Heritage and Identity in the Former Ottoman Empire. Muestro, Yerusha means our heritage in Judeo-Spanish or Ladino. To help situate us before I dive into my talk today, here's a map of the three cities that we will be discussing: Salonika, which is today known as Thessaloniki, Izmir, and Tyre. Tyre is a small city to the southeast of Izmir, about 90 kilometers or so. So I'm going to begin my lecture today with asking a question. Steve, I would like to ask you to read off any responses for me. I would like to throw it to everybody here. What is heritage to you? So take a minute to think of a response if you have a response.
While we wait for a few responses, and I should have added, if I didn't, we're going to answer other questions at the end in the chat.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, and while we're waiting for answers, your presentation is not full screen, though it's still visible.
It's not full screen for you?
Yeah, it's still showing your Adobe stuff.
Okay. So I think that'll just have to be what it is. So
yeah. Okay. One person says, "Where did I come from?"
Okay.
Which, I mean, is kind of the only. So far, it's the only answer. We're going to keep going because.
Okay. I'll let you all think about that as I go through it and see if what you were thinking of may be changing. So to give you my own perspective and definitions, I'm going to explain to you what heritage is from my perspective. So the concept of heritage has its root in the idea of patrimony. Patrimony is a French word, literally meaning what goes from the father to the son. David Lowenthal, who is probably the foremost scholar on heritage studies, or at least really is the scholar emeritus of heritage studies, has said, heritage, quote, heritage denotes everything we suppose has been handed down to us from the past. Elizabeth Chilton from UMass Amherst and Randall Mason have said the full range of inherited traditions, monuments, objects, and living environments, and most importantly, the range of contemporary activities, meanings, and behaviors that are drawn from them. These are some very key models that I made a lot of use of. However, I propose that there is something called the longue durée of heritage creation, or the long history of heritage creation. So heritage, the past is alive, even when the original actors themselves may have since passed into dust. Heritage is very much alive. There's a very good example of it in the recent American past, of when the Museum for African American History opened on the National Mall, the Smithsonian, with President Barack Obama. The person who rang the bell was the daughter of a man born into slavery. Slavery was not that far in the past, that still just a few years ago, we had somebody who was just one generation removed. She has since passed away. And in my understanding, heritage is in fact how we as humanity engages with history and interprets it to respond to the circumstances that we find ourselves in. In my research, just to clarify, this is my study is coming from my MA thesis, which I did at the University of Haifa under Drs. Ido Shahar and Dr. Shai Strugo. So I asked three key questions. The first one, what were the circumstances that led each of these communities Salonika, Izmir, and Tyre to engage with their history. 2, who are the actors involved in heritage projects in each of these cities? And 3, what are the similarities between the 3 case studies and what are their differences and what may account for these differences? So there's some heritage concepts that I have within my thesis I engaged with in the 3 case studies. So the overriding one, again, is this long history of heritage creation, that it's a long history rather than a micro history or responding to very specific circumstances, as well as native voices. I'm using native here to mean people from within the city, not native in the sense of indigenous Americans or Aboriginal peoples in Australia, New Zealand, but native meaning coming from the city. The outsiders and insiders, the tensions between local knowledge and expert knowledge, digital memory and community, which as we are engaging with today, this in fact is a very relevant example of digital memory and community, stewardship, and as is much of your interest, genealogy. So why did I pick these 3 cities? And I'm going to be using a term from my anthropology background called reflexivity, meaning that I'm situating myself within it. And it's very simple. My family comes from these places. My grandfather, who was born in New York, was the son of immigrants from Izmir and Larissa, but both families had connections to Salonika on his mother's side and to Tyre on his father's side. His aunt, my grandfather's great aunts and uncle were from Tyre, and his cousin, some of his cousins were from there. So these were all cities that I had some degree of familiarity with. This is my family in Izmir. My great-great-grandfather's at the center of this family portrait. This is a poem he wrote on the left in Eastern Sephardic script. This is a family portrait. My great-grandfather and one of his sisters had already moved to America. So this portrait in 1918, they are the 2 wedding portraits being held by their nieces. And this is in the family, this is in the courtyard of the family mansion in Izmir. And this is on my Greek side. One of my ancestors was the chief rabbi of Larissa and Komotini. He comes from a long line of important rabbis. I've had the opportunity to hold the manuscript on the left that he wrote. It's in Ben Tzvi Institute today. The middle is a signature of his. And the photo on the right is one that was taken in Sarajevo in probably the 1870s and has been passed down to me. It's sitting in the other room today. So after situating myself within this study, I begin with my first case study of Salonika. So for those of you who aren't familiar so much with Ottoman history, so the Ottoman Empire, when they took over Byzantium, took on the system called the millet system, which the Byzantines had innovated, which is essentially people who were not of the principal faith of the empire had autonomy and could control their affairs, have their own court system as long as they paid their taxes. In this case, the Ottoman Empire, this was the dhimmi tax, or the jizya for dhimmi. Dhimmi, it means a person of the book, but who is not Muslim. This comes out of also the Khalifa Umar, who was one of the first caliphs of the burgeoning Muslim empires. So throughout Ottoman Empire history, most of it is defined by this millet system. It changes a little bit as we get closer to modernity, but this is really a defining factor. And in fact, this legacy plays out today. Greece, what does it mean to be Greek? Greek Orthodox, what does it mean to be Turkish? Muslim, what does it mean to be, Israel, basically Jewish, and so on. Armenia as well as Armenian. And then this this millet system sets the stage for with the post-French Revolution. Its ideals are being imported primarily through Greek merchants, but also later through the Jewish school systems, like the Alliance, for example. So its ideals impacted growing local national movements. For the Jewish community, there wasn't so much of one Ottoman Empire, but we see that with the Greeks and Armenians especially, and then the Serbs and the Bulgarians. So the rise of what I'm calling ethno-religious nationalism was also responded to in a variety of ways. First, by this period called the Tanzimat reforms, which was when the empire was trying to reform itself from a confessional governance system into a civil, where there was no real distinction, but these distinctions remained. And then it was unfortunately ultimately met with the Hamidian era, which was marked by violence, ethnic cleansing, and genocide, and the death throes of the Ottoman Empire, most famously resulting in the Armenian genocide, as well as the expulsion of the Pontic Greeks, the so-called population transfer between Greece and Turkey, and so on. Now, Salonika, which some of you might be familiar with, has this moniker, this nickname. It's called the City of Ghosts. And I'm going to use the Turkish term here for a person from Salonika, Salonikli. Amongst the Jewish community in Salonika, what I'm terming modern historical consciousness or heritage conceptualization and identity begins developing in the late 19th century. This was an elite-driven effort, initially influenced by influences such as competition with the other millets, especially with the modern successor states like Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, and also the academicization of Jewish history and culture with the Haskalah movement emanating out of Germany. The key figures amongst this early movement were Joseph Nehemiah, Isaac Emanuel, Michael Mocho, Hacham Shaul Amario, the teacher Baruch Ben Yaakov, and Mercado Koval. Most of these were rabbis. They were very prominent individuals, and other than Baruch Ben Yaakov and Mercado Koval, Shaul Amario predeceased the Holocaust. He was one of the last chief rabbis of Salonika. But Baruch Ben Yaakov and Mercado Koval both died in the lead up or shortly after the deportation of Jews from Salonika to Auschwitz. Whereas Nehemiah is a survivor who remained in Salonika the rest of his years. Emmanuel had left Salonika. He had taken up a position as the rabbi of Mikveh Israel in Curacao in the 30s, so he was not a survivor. But Michael Mocho also returned to Salonika, but the last decade of his life, he had been hired to be rabbi to one of the communities in Argentina and lived out his days there, though he continued to produce historical research and works and publications on the city of Salonika. So the first, one of the biggest things that marks the city was the ancient Jewish necropolis of Salonika, which was the community's most outstanding landmark on the city's landscape. And what I mean by that is that even though there are buildings and Salonika was the plurality or even outright majority of people within the city for 500 years, there were fires regularly. So while the buildings were being reconstructed on a regular basis, the necropolis was hundreds of thousands of graves attesting to the Jewish presence in the city. It even included some of the early Roman Jewish graves that were found also within the cemetery. So it had been a place of importance to the Jewish community for functionally 2,000 years. And it was also, as I write, a site of religious significance, but also for the simple fact of the monument of the 450 years of continued Jewish presence in the city of Salonika. And this is a photo of the cemetery before it was destroyed. As you can see, this is just, it was immense. It's been estimated to possibly be up to at least 300,000 graves, if not 500,000 graves and above. So it was a complete, I'll continue. So there were multiple efforts to document the cemetery, including manuscripts, pamphlets, monumental books. These efforts began in the late 19th century, including some of the examples are Yitzhak Amarillo's gravestones of the Amarillo family, Shaul Amarillo's the tradition of graves and epitaphs of the religious leaders of Salonika, a booklet published by Baruch Ben Yaakov entitled Yisrael. Michael Moho, who originally published the first part of his in the Jewish cemetery of Jewish Salonika in 1932-33, who would then go to write on his very monumental work by the same title, which was published posthumously in 1974. And then there was the Greats of Salonika for All Generations, written in 36 by Isaac Emanuel, who would then write also Matzavot Saloniki, which its English title is Precious Stones, in 1963. So as part of my thesis, I researched a news article that really attested to the development of historical consciousness and identity amongst the Jews of Salonika. It comes from the Hellenist Zionist newspaper of Tikvatenu in 1935. The title is Nuestras Faltedas, un Museo Judío. Our Faults, a Jewish museum. So within this article, we really start to see both the heritage consciousness fully developed at this point in the 1930s, as opposed, as well as just an attestament to there was lots of stuff there. So the first quote that I really feel encaptures this idea is, en muchas comunidades, estudiando una longa historia y un chico museo entretenido por la comunidad y donde se topan exposados objetos de culto, manuscritos diversos y reproducciones interesantes. Ya es hora que nuestra comunidad tenga su museo. So I'm going to translate that. In many communities, having a long history and a small museum within it for the community, so that there can be expositions on religious objects, different manuscripts, and interesting reproductions. And the most important part is, now is the time that our community will have its museum. And then he goes on to write, La historia de los judíos tesalónico va a ver bien presto la luz, that the history of the Jews of Salonika will be seen in the light well. And then attesting to what was known within the city prior to 1942, se puede recoger pergaminos de familias condenadas y liberadas por la Inquisición. That you can also research and document the manuscripts and documents of the families who were condemned and liberated from the Inquisition, that these families had carried with them to Salonika. So I entitled this section now Salonika to Thessaloniki. This is a very political point. Thessaloniki is the Greek name of the city, and Salonika becoming Thessaloniki is really the transformation of the Ottoman Salonika, which was plurality or majority Jewish, into a Greek Orthodox city, following the population transfer and then the destruction of the community by the Nazis. So this destruction in the Shoah at the hands of the Nazis and their Greek collaborators and Bulgarian collaborators put a sudden stop on the mature heritage discussions that had emerged in Salonika. From 1945 until the 1970s, this discussion was really dominated by survivors trying to memorialize their family, friends, and history that were erased by the Nazis. I mentioned Michael Molcho and Isaac Nehemiah earlier. They wrote a French tome, 2 volumes, En Memoriam, it was called, which was both a history, but also just documenting and remembering the community and their family members and friends that have been murdered. And then also there, as a right below, Michael Molcho, Nehemiah, and Emmanuel were key figures here. There were also 2 Yizkor books published by survivors at this time. The first one was Salonika, Mother City of Israel. And then the second one is Zichron Saloniki, the Memory of Salonika. And Zichron Saloniki is generally regarded as the, in terms of being a more rigorous book on academic work, as well as just the history, whereas Salonika, the Mother of Israel, is more of a memorialization book. So in 1975, in 40 years since the call for a Jewish museum, we start revisiting this idea of El Museo Gidio, the Jewish museum. In 75, former community president Dick Benveniste created the first attempt at Jewish museum in Greek Salonika. And then shortly afterwards, this museum was in the upstairs of a municipal building. And then Miriam Notich, who was one of the curators and exhibit creators at the Ghetto Fighters Museum in northern Israel, at the Ghetto Fighters kibbutz near Akko. She created the first, let's say, professional exhibition detailing the Jewish, the history of Jewish Thessalonica from the Romans until today. And then in 1986, the first public Shoah memorial in the city was erected in the Platia Evreon Matirion, the plaza of the Jewish martyrs. That one is a political issue, and it's been basically forgotten, is a good way to put it. Not by the Jewish community, but as an attempt on erasure by the local population. But I'll discuss that a little bit further as we continue. And then the 500th anniversary in 1992 of the expulsion of Jews from Spain, the community became much more actively interested in issues of heritage and history. And in 1994, the community established the plan to construct the modern Jewish museum there today. Andreas Safijas, who was the community president at the time, in his memoir states, quote, "There has been a Jewish presence in Thessaloniki for hundreds of years without a single break. Yet there is hardly a street name left to commemorate the fact, even though hundreds of streets in the city had Jewish names up until the German occupation. The members of this community gave it its identity and shaped its heritage, but there are few visible signs left to tell the tale. I reiterated this sad fact to every dignitary I spoke to. It was the main theme of many a conversation between members of the Jewish community who saw the evidence of the Jewish presence in the city fading before their eyes. We felt a museum might help keep the past alive." In 1997, there was another new Shoah memorial unveiled in the city, and the first iteration of the modern museum opened in 1997. It was a bit of a soft opening, as the photo you see on the left is of the building today, which was taken by Sam Saltiel, which was formally opened in 2001. It had broken ground around 97. And now going back to the politics of the city today, Mayor Boutaris, who I believe has finished out his terms, he was elected in 2011, and he's actually has made approaching the ghost of Salonika a major part of his administration. The poster on the left is a poster of an event in 2011-2012 called Thessaloniki Cultural Crossroads, which was not only celebrating the Jewish history, but also the Muslim past of the city. though there are politics there where they weren't really talking about Turkish Muslims, but they had stuff about Arab Muslims, and which is its own discussion of Greek politics. But really, Mayor Boutaris, who has been a big friend to the Jewish community and ally. Some of you might even be familiar with him because he made international news a few years ago when he actively called out what the past of the Greek community, especially, and what they had done with the Jews and the Holocaust, and would walk hand in hand with them on Holocaust Memorial Day every year. And he faced down Golden Dawn, which are the neo-Nazis in Greece, and even was assaulted, but he didn't phase from these threats and just continued to make this emphasis a major part. And as a result, too, the Jewish community took this opportunity and seized the chance to erect another memorial, this time to the destruction of the Jewish cemetery on the campus of Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, which is where the cemetery is and was, as well as they have developed fully fleshed out plans for another museum focused on the Holocaust. And as my friend Devin Nahr had told me in a conversation, the community are doing something a bit different, which is creating something new through the monuments and museums. They are testaments and memorials that are activated for the sake of heritage politics today, and to create a modicum of the kinds of institutions and dynamics that existed prior to the war. So that was a very quick overview of Salonika. I could go much further in depth, but now we're going to move on to the city of Izmir, where there's a very different Jewish heritage project ongoing. So Izmir and Salonika are intimately and inextricably linked. Izmir in the 17th century transformed from a backwater village to a vibrant metropolis with the rise of the cotton trade. The Jewish community there, even though there's evidence of a small transient Jewish community in the city, as is attested to the fact that one of the synagogues is called Eitz Chaim. Eitz Chaim synagogues in the Ottoman Empire usually indicate the Romanio community, or that had existed long before. Eitz Chaim is the typical name of a synagogue for Romanio even till today. So during this period in the early 17th century, the Jewish community really actually began formally organizing. There were three groups of major migrants to the city at this time. First were the early migrants from Anatolia, the Turkish mainland. Then there was a large emigration of Jews in the 1620s from Salonika, which is when the community really formally organized, and its earliest rabbinic leaders were from Salonika. And then there were the Portuguese Jews who weren't as large population-wise, but were a significant impact on the development of the city. So here is a view of Izmir in the 17th, 18th century from of an engraving found in the National Library of France. So unlike Salonika, Izmirli Jews did not, for the most part, engage with their history and heritage. In 1892, Izmir did, along with Istanbul and Salonika, they did celebrate the 400th anniversary of the expulsion from Spain, but this was part of an elite-driven effort to reshape the community from the Jewish millet into Jewish citizens of the empire. There were poems extolling Abdul Hamid II and his ancestors for delivering very biblical imagery of delivering from, of our deliverance, a la, Moses in Egypt. But this didn't really take hold in Izmir after the fact, but there were some local activists like our own de Yosef Hazan and Alexander Bengyat, both of whom had newspapers and they were activists themselves. So they would engage, but it wasn't necessarily a community effort like it truly became in Salonika. So for example, the Bahi Baba Cemetery in 1878-79, the cemetery was appropriated by Ottoman authorities to house Muslim refugees of the Russo-Ottoman War. There's not a lot of discussion that's been found. There might be at some point something in the Ottoman archives, but it seems that there was no major discussion amongst the Jewish community in any of the Hebrew books published or anything from the rabbis, and the newspaper doesn't really talk about it. This was a fairly normal event in the Ottoman Empire. We see famously, for example, when the Ottoman Empire wanted to build a new road out of Jaffa heading north, it ran right through the Muslim cemetery of Jaffa, which was quite large. And so the Ottoman authorities basically said, we gave notice for you to remove your family members and gravestones as we are building a new road. It wasn't a so-called discriminatory policy like what happened with the Jewish cemetery in Salonika. In 1914, again, the cemetery was further appropriated to construct a school. There was some protest from the community, but it didn't end up amounting to anything. Now, what's interesting is it appears that the Greeks had a bit of a dry run with Izmir before their destruction ultimately of the cemetery in Salonika. They enacted a similar plan to Salonika and planned the full destruction of the cemetery to build Ionian University during the Greek occupation of Izmir during the 1919-1922 Greco-Turkish War. But ultimately, the university was never built as the Greeks were forced to withdraw before it could be done. But they had already by that point fully demolished the cemetery, and the Jewish community rescued the remains and transferred them to the Ger Chesme Cemetery in 1921. Ger Chesme was opened in the 19th century following the late 19th century following the Bahri Baba Cemetery initial appropriation, also as it had grown quite full. So now following the events of Bahri Baba, especially in the early 1920s with the issues and protests of the Greek plan, there is little indication of any communal engagement with its heritage for many years. There were more pressing concerns such as the decline of the community, not due to any persecution necessarily, but just the decline due to outward migration from Izmir to mainly Istanbul, Israel, France, and North America. Though there was, in certain periods, some of it due to the political situation. And, were there other issues? So I spoke to one of my mother's relatives who is a native of Izmir, and he told me when he was growing up in the 50s and 60s, quote, "Our fathers did not allow us to know, and our heritage was taken away." And this is a bit of a literal fact. The extensive archives of the community were almost completely transferred to Israel. Unlike the, most famously, the Aleppo Codex, which was basically stolen from Syria, and the Aleppo community is still trying to sue for it to be returned to their care, even though the Aleppo community is now based in New York, Deal, New Jersey, Mexico City, primarily. This was the head of the Beit Din in Izmir at the time, Yosef Ashkenazi, brought the archives with him when he took up the post of the chief rabbi of Yehud in Israel. And after he passed, the Central Archives for the History of the Jewish People at Hebrew University purchased the archive from his family. So I'm going to take a quick break, but I wanted to, again, stop for a question, and you can write your answers in the chat. What does outsider and insider mean to you? All right. So in Izmir, I'm not going to answer the question quite yet, but in Izmir, the first attempt to document came with Dr. Mina Rosen's cemetery survey during the 1980s and early 1990s. Until a month ago, well, this now it's a year ago. This data was unpublished, but is now accessible to all. This would be the most traditional outsider-insider dialectic, with academic expert knowledge being situated against local communal needs. Not a comment on the outcomes of this project, but I was told by the community that they were never given access to any of the data on the cemetery. She had documented her Chesma cemetery. So that's always a bit of an issue when an outsider comes and documents something from your community and then doesn't share the results for the community's needs, and also because, quite frankly, it's their heritage. Also mine, as I do, as much of my family is buried in Gerd Chesma. Oops. So the next attempt came over a decade later with the Journey into Jewish Heritage program of Zalman Shazar Center, ICOMOS, the International Council on Monuments and Sites branch in Israel, and the Bezalel Academy of Arts and Design, supported by the Avichai Foundation. 5 areas of study emerged: daily life, cortejos, which were basically the multi-generational family homes, the book collection, the synagogues, and the cemetery. To the left is a documentation card that part of the documentation they did of the Portugal synagogue. At that time, it's done with a lot of, at that time, contemporary professional standards for preservation, historic preservation work. Here are some examples of different aspects. So this is, on the left is documenting the Shalom synagogue, and showing where they're taking the pictures from, which is a standard in historic preservation. On the right is a picture of a since demolished cortejo. And the sketch was actually done from the memory of some of the inhabitants of that said cortejo. It had been demolished like 20 or 30 years prior to this work documenting the history, but this is a good example of it. And then the third and most lasting attempt began about 10 years ago, which is called the Izmir Jewish Heritage Museum Project, initiated by the Kiryati Foundation of Israel, based in Tel Aviv. It has built a partnership between outside experts and local community leaders and the community itself. The project is situated in ongoing heritage politics of Turkey, where under Erdogan, the country has sought to commodify heritage sites as well as support preservation projects on minority communities, such as the Edirne Synagogue, in order to appeal to global multiculturalism, as well as appeal to his government's neo-Ottomanist local and foreign policy. Some of you might even be familiar with this photo just a year ago, where the Hagia Sophia was transformed back into a fully functioning public mosque. And this is a quote from Erdogan himself. "This is Hagia Sophia breaking away from its captivity chains. It was the greatest dream of our youth. It was the yearning of our people, and it has been accomplished." So this is very much, all this is situated within this complicated brew of heritage politics within Turkey that suits both local as well as foreign power projection of Erdogan and his government. So the ongoing project is ambitious. It's seeking to turn the complex of synagogues of the city into a living museum. They are engaging the local community as well as expert professionals in preservation to accomplish this task. Without the funding and initiative of the foundation, it is likely this project would never have been able to get off the ground, especially due to the ongoing difficult political situation under Erdogan and continued outward migration of the Jewish community to mainly Israel, Canada, US. So just for more information about it, I would recommend you to be in contact with Uri Barner Nisim Ben Joya, and follow the project on Facebook. As the project has matured, I am very happy to say they've really come along and have really built a strong partnership in Izmir. And there's a lot of really cool things going on there now. And it's an excellent example of a outside-inside partnership. So the final part of my case study is the city of Tire. So Tire was never, unlike Izmir Slanka, it was never a large community, nor does it have any descendants of the community left there today. The last person from the community who was living there died in 2009. Like Izmir with Slanka, Tire is also deeply linked to Izmir. But for both Izmir and Slanka, they have historic prestige both within and outside of it, within the Jewish community, outside of it, that buoys any efforts towards ends of heritage and Jewish history. But for the most part, there hasn't been a whole lot of documentation. The famous Sephardic Jewish journalist and historian Abraham Galante wrote his histories in the 30s on the city. The cemetery had been only documented tangentially in the same survey by Amina Rosen. Then Dr. Gila Hadar did her master's thesis on the community in '96 that worked on documents from the community in the 19th and 20th century. And then Turkish Jewish historian Siren Bora, whose work is unfortunately in Turkish and not particularly accessible to a non-Turkish speaking crowd, has written some really excellent work on the community in the past decade. So here's a engraving of the city of Tire. This comes from 1720. So what is stewardship? So the question of stewardship is, when the original community no longer exists in a place, what happens to their heritage? Stewardship comes out of this concept that grew out of the effects of colonialism, imperialism, ethnic cleansing, and genocide, which have left the heritage of communities to the whims of local interest and protection. For most of us here, this is most prominent with all the Jewish cemeteries and synagogues in Europe following the Nazi genocide. For proper stewards, they are locals who provide a bulwark against neglect or destruction of the community's heritage. But also proper stewards help the descendant community wherever they are now to access their heritage and also be an advocate or voice for them in the city. So the Jews of Tire project began in 2013 under the aegis of the municipality under then Mayor Tayfur Çiçek. It was conducted in accordance with other projects documenting the ancient history of the community, as well as its more recent past, including on the Greeks and the Armenians in the city. Çiçek then asked his nephew Murat Sanus to lead the project after initially being brought in to help reorganize the economic structure of the municipality. This is Murat on the left. He graduated from Marmara University, Faculty of Economics, went on to work for one of the largest banks in Turkey, and then started a company with two childhood friends of his. And so once he had completed his economic work and he took up his uncle's offer to move into the city's cultural office and take over managing these projects. So he founded the Jews of Tire Turkey Facebook group in 2015. He told me the purpose of this group is to help people to find their ancestors who lived in Tire, Izmir, Turkey. We have thousands of documents about the Jewish community, such as marriage, funerals, school and cemetery records, as well as pictures of the families and individuals. We'd be glad to help you in any ways. You are encouraged to share your photos, documents, and stories of the community. As of last year, there were 499 members of the group, including myself and Sanus. Most of the members are from Israel and Turkey, with the remainder found across the world in places such as the United States, Spain, and Costa Rica. The group is not only a place for descendants to renew connections, but also a place to crowdsource information about documents, objects, and photos. Crowdsourcing is a powerful and effective tool for encouraging participation and discussion. On the left are two examples that Sanus crowdsourced information from the group in order to better work with the project. Crowdsourcing also deconstructs this hierarchy of expert versus layperson, and instead treats everyone as equal stakeholders and holders of knowledge. So famous anthropologists Neil Silverman and Margaret Purser wrote that about digital memory. It is our contention that digital technologies offer a new medium not only for conversation and contact, but also for the construction of viable, continuous memory communities that creatively reassemble fragments from a shared past into a dynamic, reflective expression of contemporary identity. The potential of these digital communities to restore a sense of collective memory is enormous. And as I mentioned earlier today, what we're doing today over Zoom is itself an example of this process. So Sanus Art also created a freely accessible database and book that anyone can access. Unfortunately, it's no longer accessible, but I'll get to that after this. At the time, it included more than 5,000 unique individuals and 166 surnames. The only limiting factor for inclusion in the database was that these are people who appeared in the documents in the municipality or the cemetery. A positive outgrowth of the project has also been that people join this group asking if they can get, if this project can be done in their own city in Turkey, like Izmir or Edirne or Bursa, any of these cities. There's all the time, even today, there's posts like that my family came from, Izmir. Do you have information? Here's a screenshot of what the site looked like before I was taken offline. And then this is part of why Murat saw himself as a steward. And he said to me, quote, "Simply everything," meaning heritage. You can't shape your future if you are unaware of your past. Tyre was a cosmopolitan city. Lydians, Romans, Byzantine peoples, Persians, Greeks, Rooms, Jews, Armenians, Bulgarians, and tens of different Turkish tribes lived here. We owe our unique cultural heritage to those communities. And for me, each of those nations is an ancestor of me. And so on the topic of genealogy, which is a big part of the Tyre project, I look at, what Alondra Nelson says, that genealogy is as much about the needs and desires of the living as they are portals to the past. Weitzman writes that the ability to discover one's family history is seen not only as a fun and meaningful way to connect to history, but also as a way to stake a claim to heritage, a quest for roots in a rootless age. Welke and Timothy point out that critics of family history reason that an individual's self or identity cannot be a matter of blood quantum, of imaginative ties to a remote ancestral village that has dramatically evolved since one's forebears emigrated, or of locating progenitors in 18th century parish registers. And Julie Rack writes that genealogy asks not just about what happened, but why we think the way we do. And so in regards to the Facebook group and about this genealogy question, Murat told me, quote, "I think you are personally a witness to that. Many cousins found each other in the group. I have helped a few hundred people to discover their ancestors. Many people learned the name of their great-grandfather and saw their pictures from my work. It is priceless to see their astonishment and gratefulness for my efforts." So before I go on to my conclusion, sadly, Murat's uncle was voted out and the administration changed in the city. And these heritage projects no longer were a priority and they let them lapse. And in fact, for a brief period of time, there was such an outcry about the project of the Jewish project that the city reinstated the domain, renewed the domain. So that was still accessible, but now it's only accessible through web archive. And there's no indication of if it will ever come back to being online, unfortunately. But there are artifacts such as the books that have all this information. They are in Turkish, unfortunately, but they are still accessible. So moving to my conclusion, the long durée of heritage. So to me, heritage, it is the representation of the past and the present today. It is the way we interact, understand, and derive meaning from the past to fit our contemporary lives. It simultaneously belongs to its genealogical descendants and to the peoples and governments which occupy the space today. And it is an instrumentalization of history. The manifesto of the Association of Critical Heritage Studies states that, quote, the old way of looking at heritage, the authorized heritage discourse, privileges old, grand, prestigious, expert-approved sites, buildings and artifacts that sustain Western narratives of nation, class, and science. To me, heritage is also a continual discussion and subject to circumstances outside of the control of the communities and stewards. And as I mentioned, while the Izmir project in Slanka continue forward, Mayor Chichek was replaced, unfortunately, and the new administration has no interest in the. Not only was it temporarily shut down, but now it's no longer accessible except through web archive. So if you would like to get in contact with me, my email is michael@hollander-waas.com. And I would just like to say thank you and muchas gracias for your attention and for the opportunity to speak to you today. And I open the floor to questions. Thank you.
So right now, the only question we had, Michael, was where are these cities? The person who asked the question is not in the room anymore, but if you want to answer, feel free.
Yep.
I'm not sure.
Here you go.
Awesome, thank you. And just for my own edification, where are these in relation to Castoria?
Castoria is close to Salonika.
Okay, because my uncle by marriage's family is from that place that I just
Castoria.
Castoria,
Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot in the way of an archive that has survived from Castoria. Some of the cemetery has survived though, but it's not accessible from outside of Greece.
Right. No, I had a little brain burp trying to say the word, but yeah, I found that too, trying to help my uncle with his maternal side.
Mm-hmm.
So
you can always shoot me a message with that, and I can take a look for you and see if I know of any leads for you.
Sure, definitely. Did anybody else have any questions? I think I lost the window. The question window. Where'd it go?
While you're looking, Steve, I have a question.
Sure.
Just thinking here in Western Pennsylvania, the first history of the community was in 1918, and then the second was in 1942. So obviously during World War I and World War II. Both of those I've always felt had something of a defensive gesture to them. And in hearing you talk today, it does feel like a lot of these things are responses to things that are going on in the broader community, rather than kind of a spontaneous moment of pride in their own community. And I'm wondering if that's an accurate assessment, that these are often defensive gestures, for lack of a better word.
So I wouldn't term it a defensive gesture. There can be aspects that feel defensive, like, that staking that we're also a part of the city, for example, that in a way that's sort of a defensive gesture, but I wouldn't necessarily see it that way. That feels a little too reactive as opposed to a community with agency. Now, that all being said, none of these projects ever exist in a vacuum. Even the fact that there was a golden opportunity with this small period of time that the TRA project existed was entirely due to the fact that it had become normalized, even if it was at least for Erdogan's gain, to engage with the minority history of Turkey. Erdogan's politics, he likes to project that Turkey is a cosmopolitan place. It does have a cosmopolitan history, but it's only good if the cosmopolitans are dead, and that they're just people who come to spend their tourist money and visit. So there's a bit of that, but at the same time, on the local level, there was still a lot of agency, and the municipality said, we want to engage with heritage tourism. But in this case, they did it in I don't want to say it was, whereas Erdogan's pretty cynical. There are certainly cynical aspects to it, such as economic gain from increased tourism, because TRA today, it's not like Izmir, you show up because people say, oh, Izmir, that's where Ephesus is, or Kushadasi, which is a resort town on the other side of the bay. But Tire, which is not too far from Izmir, said, oh, we want people to come see it's a beautiful city with parks and rivers and everything. So this was a way to engage with that. But there wasn't necessarily this fully cynical, we're only doing this to pull in tourism, but they actually were documenting, making available stuff that no other city to this point has done in Turkey. These records that are usually locked in the city hall under lock and key, even to descendants of the community. So, but those, the timing of those histories too with Pittsburgh is all part of the same more academicization of history that was ongoing. And it does, again, all tie back into the Haskalah emanating out of Germany. But by that point, there were some famous Jewish historians. The Jewish Encyclopedia had just been published you said 1918, so 12 years prior, which was the first real monumental work to try to capture the entirety of Jewish history. There was people like Cecil Roth working on this, Samuel Schwartz, working on a lot of the times Sephardic Jews, but from this romantic perspective. But yeah, no, there is a reason why you start seeing these projects come out in the 19th and 20th century. And it is due to this, no longer was, history and heritage. I wouldn't even say heritage at that point because it wasn't used that way, but history was not just the purview of elites with their curio cabinet, collecting little artifacts or going on the grand tour to show their, great Western heritage and history, like Mark Twain going to Jerusalem and whatnot. You see that the grand tour was called, but this is where you start seeing the local communities taking existing in that context and then realizing that they can do it themselves.
Very interesting. Thank you.
So we have one person that commented that there was a man from Salonika who lived in Pittsburgh for a long time. He came here as a kid in 1944. Thank you for the information. Another person asked, have names in Salonika Cemetery been documented anywhere? He adds he has difficulty locating pre-Holocaust relatives from Salonika, Ergas, Saporta, Halivis. I have trouble with Polish.
I can read it.
Okay.
Do you mean Halegua as opposed to Halivis? And yes, the names have been documented in the books I mentioned. There's something like I would say about 3,000 graves, their epitaphs were documented. There's plenty more that exist in fragments that are still around the city today. But for example, I have the epitaphs of some of my ancestors from Salonika because they were the chief rabbi. So they were deemed important enough at the beginning. The idea was at the beginning of the documentation was to really get a broad view, but also include the quote unquote great figures of the city. So the leaders, rabbis, famous events, unusual epitaphs. So some of you might be familiar with the Portuguese doctor Amatus Lusitanis. And his grave in Salonika was one of the ones documented. And it's fascinating because it's in Latin. It's fully in Latin. So that's one of the reasons. Beyond that, he was a famous member, but it was a unique and unusual grave. My suspicion is that if the Holocaust hadn't happened, that the cemetery probably would have been fully documented. But unfortunately, we'll never know. But those names are all there. I can tell you which communities they belong to because we have the synagogue registers which listed which communities they belong to. For example, Ergas belonged to the Portuguese synagogues. Saporta, if I remember off the top of my head, was Yerusha Sefarad. So meaning the wasn't a geographic origin, but other than that, they were descendants of the exiles. Baruch, it all depends. Baruch is a fairly common surname. You see it in Italian, Sephardic communities. So that one's a little more difficult to work with in terms of but sometimes the families are unique and can be found in only a couple of the synagogues.
It appears, so no one else has added any other questions. So I guess
I'm going to actually, I see early on that Michael Duran wrote about my heritage question.
yes.
I'm just going to read it off to everybody here. To keep it simple, he responded, heritage entails the preservation and continuity of memory as it applies to one's cultural affinity, identity being a product of that affinity, possibly to a greater extent than biology. So just wanted to capture that, but that definitely falls under what I'm proposing, though it's not the only thing that comes out of heritage, but that the reason I end up writing my thesis here is that I don't want, to use a metaphor from music, Arnold Schoenberg, who some of you are probably familiar with, if not, more familiar with his grandson, Randy. He saw himself as the great end to the genealogy of the great German composers. He saw himself as the end, the finality of the tradition started by the Bachs and Beethoven, and continuing all the way to him. But again, heritage is not just on this one spectrum. It's always being redefined, reevaluated, even though we didn't really have this concept as necessarily the way we do today until past, half century is when it really starts coming out, and it gets really popularized through genealogy, with roots, famously, as many of us are familiar with. But also it ties into, with the UN, the development of UNESCO and World Heritage Sites, and there was this mad dash to that UNESCO essentially led to people using it as a way of like a checklist of like, okay, I'm a worldly person, I've gone to this place, and so now and you see that a lot, and so that it grew into this commodification of heritage, and really expanded out of it's really grown in many different ways, and out of the original purview where it was really elite driven, or and by elite driven I mean from political on down, or community leaders, and not necessarily allowing it to come from the bottom up, from the people of the community. But it became originally a marker of status, and now it's a marker of being a marker of status, but I know my history, I know my heritage, or I'm a worldly person. I've gone to see all these famous sites in the global human heritage, or I've tried all these foods, or in the innumerable different ways, but it's all part of this act of heritage creation and engagement.
I'll let my dad know.
Yeah, and I just want to add, and unfortunately, it's also been used to very nefarious ends, such as, again, the Nazis, white supremacy, the very damaging ultra-nationalists that really see themselves as, we are the primary, it's our heritage, it's ours to keep, everybody else is beneath us. So all of this is part of that spectrum of heritage, engagement, and identity.
Right. I can say you weren't kidding about being done by 2:10. Okay, then since we did schedule to be done by 2 anyway, we went over by about 15 minutes. Give everyone else the rest of their afternoons back. Eric, I'll see you in about 15 minutes. And everyone have a nice evening or afternoon. And thank you for coming. For more information on the JGS of Pittsburgh, please visit our website, pghjgs.org. And we can also be found on Facebook for those of you who have not already found us before. And thank you.
Thank you.